Federal agent Marcus Reed never imagined his most dangerous battle would take place on a street in America. One moment, he was quietly doing his job. The next, sirens blared, hands pressed him against a cold sheet of metal, and voices refused to listen to his truth. A real criminal gang vanished, but Marcus remained, judged by his silence and his skin. They mistook restraint for guilt, unaware that the man they apprehended was protecting something far greater. Before we begin, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from today? And if you believe that justice always uncovers the truth and protects the right people without exception, then this story is for you. A cold autumn night settled over downtown Cleveland, quiet but restless. The sky hung low with heavy clouds, trapping the city's yellow streetlights beneath a dull gray ceiling. A sharp wind moved through the narrow streets, carrying the smell of rain and asphalt, rattling loose paper cups and leaves along the sidewalks. It was the kind of night when tension lingered just beneath the surface, when sirens felt closer than usual, even before they sounded. Cleveland had learned how to hide its fractures behind glass towers and neon signs, but on streets like East 9th, the pressure never truly faded. Daniel Carter stepped out of a small convenience store on the corner, the automatic door sliding shut behind him with a soft hiss. He was a black man in his early 30s, tall and powerfully built, with the kind of frame shaped by discipline rather than display. At 6'3", his presence was impossible to miss, yet he carried himself with deliberate restraint. He wore a plain black t-shirt, slightly stretched across broad shoulders, and dark jeans scuffed at the knees from long use. A black baseball cap sat low on his head, shadowing eyes that were observant, calculating, and deeply tired. Daniel's face was angular, his jawline firm, his expression calm to the point of seeming distant. He rarely showed emotion in public, an old habit shaped by years of training and reinforced by experience. Silence had once kept him alive. It had taught him patience, control, and how to disappear in plain sight. Tonight, he was doing exactly that. He adjusted the strap of a worn backpack, slung over one shoulder, and glanced briefly at the street before stepping forward. That was when the shouting began. 4 young men burst out from between 2 parked cars across the street. They couldn't have been older than their early 20s, all wearing dark hoodies, loose jeans, and sneakers built for speed. Their movements were chaotic, laughing too loudly, shoving one another, spilling into the sidewalk with reckless confidence. One of them swung his arm aggressively, bumping into a passing pedestrian. A woman screamed. Another voice shouted in anger. One of the youths pulled something metallic from his pocket, thin, reflective, catching the streetlight for just a second. It was impossible to tell if it was a knife, a tool, or something else entirely, but the reaction was immediate. Panic spread fast. People stumbled backward. A couple dropped their bags. Someone yelled for the police. The group scattered in an instant, splitting apart like birds startled by a sudden noise. They ran, north, west, into alleys and side streets, fast, light, practiced. And then came the sirens. Red and blue lights flooded the street as 2 police cruisers skidded to a stop. Officers jumped out, weapons drawn, voices loud and overlapping. But instead of chasing the fleeing figures disappearing into the dark, their attention locked onto the nearest stationary body. Daniel Carter. "Hey, you! Stop right there!" Daniel froze. He turned slowly, hands open, confusion flashing across his face. "Officer, I didn't—" He never finished the sentence. A heavy hand slammed into his back, forcing him forward. His chest hit the cold brick wall of the building beside the store, knocking the breath from his lungs. His backpack slid off his shoulder and hit the ground. "Hands behind your back now!" Daniel complied immediately, raising his arms and moving them behind him with controlled precision. He knew better than to resist. He knew what sudden movements could cost. Metal cuffs snapped shut around his wrists, too tight. "Wait, this is a mistake," he said, his voice steady despite the pain. "You've got the wrong person." "Shut up," one officer barked. The officer restraining him was Officer Brian Calloway, a white man in his late 30s with a thick neck and a rigid stance. His face was flushed, jaw clenched, eyes sharp with adrenaline. Calloway had been on the force for over a decade and prided himself on instinct. He believed hesitation got cops killed. Tonight, instinct told him this man was dangerous. Beside him stood Officer Luke Mason, slightly younger, broader, quieter. Mason said nothing as he watched Daniel carefully, his hand resting near his weapon. His eyes flicked briefly toward the empty street where the real suspects had fled, but only for a moment. They didn't pursue. They didn't ask questions. A small crowd began to gather. People slowed their steps, curiosity overtaking fear. Phones came out. Whispers rippled through the group like a wave. A middle-aged woman clutched her purse tighter. "See? I knew it," she muttered. A man shook his head. "They're always the same." Someone else scoffed. "Bet he had a weapon on him." Daniel heard every word. He kept his head up, jaw tight, breathing measured. Inside, something old and familiar settled into his chest. A heavy, bitter weight he had felt before. Being judged without evidence. Being silenced before speaking. Across the street, standing half-hidden near a bus stop, Sarah Whitman watched. Sarah was a white woman in her early 40s, tall and slender, with tired eyes and a posture that leaned slightly forward as if she carried invisible weight. Her blonde hair was pulled into a loose bun, strands escaping in the wind. She wore a beige coat over office clothes and clutched her phone in one hand, uncertain. Sarah wasn't brave by nature. Years earlier, she had learned to avoid confrontation after witnessing a violent arrest that left her shaken and silent. She told herself that staying out of it was safer. Still, something about the scene felt wrong. She had seen the young men run. She had seen Daniel step out of the store, and she said nothing. Officer Calloway pushed Daniel away from the wall and turned him around sharply. "What were you doing out here?" he demanded. "I was buying water," Daniel answered calmly. "That's all." Calloway laughed under his breath. "Yeah, sure." The officer bent down, roughly grabbing the fallen backpack and rifling through it. Inside were a notebook, a charger, a folded map, and a plain wallet. No weapon, no drugs. Calloway frowned, irritated, not relieved. "Where's the rest of it?" he asked. "There is no rest," Daniel replied quietly. That was when Calloway shoved him again. The sirens faded as one cruiser pulled away, chasing shadows far too late. Daniel was led toward the remaining car, cuffed, watched, judged. As they opened the back door, Daniel glanced once more at the street, the empty space where the real culprits had vanished, the people who now avoided his eyes, the city that had already decided who he was. He said nothing. And Cleveland swallowed another quiet injustice beneath the sound of closing doors. The ride to the precinct was short, but violent in its own quiet way. Rain began to fall as the cruiser cut through Cleveland's streets, tapping sharply against the windows like impatient fingers. Daniel Carter sat in the back seat, wrists cuffed behind him, shoulders forced forward by the narrow space. The plastic bench was cold, molded without comfort, designed for control rather than humanity. Red and blue lights washed over his face in rhythmic flashes, briefly illuminating his calm expression before plunging it back into shadow. Daniel did not speak. He had learned long ago that words, when offered to the wrong ears, could become weapons used against you. The police station rose from the pavement like a concrete block of authority, gray, windowed, uninviting. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, flattening everything beneath them. The air smelled of disinfectant, stale coffee, and old paper. Daniel was pulled from the car and guided, pushed, through the intake area. His name was taken quickly, his belongings catalogued with careless hands. No one looked him in the eye. He was escorted into an interrogation room barely large enough for the table bolted to the floor and 3 chairs. The walls were a dull off-white, scuffed and marked from years of quiet confrontations. A camera blinked red in the corner. Officer Brian Calloway entered first, removing his jacket and tossing it over the back of a chair. He moved with the confidence of a man accustomed to being obeyed, his posture stiff, his jaw tight. Calloway's face carried the permanent impatience of someone who believed order was something to be enforced, not questioned. Behind him came Detective Aaron Collins, a man in his early 50s with thinning brown hair and deep-set eyes. Collins was slimmer, quieter, and far more dangerous in his efficiency. He had built a career on quick closures. To him, speed meant competence. They sat across from Daniel. "Name," Collins said, clicking his pen. "Daniel Carter," Daniel replied evenly. "What were you doing on East 9th tonight?" Calloway demanded before Collins could continue. "I've already said. I was at the convenience store." Calloway scoffed. "Funny how that's where the suspect was spotted." "I am not your suspect," Daniel said calmly. "You chased the wrong man." The chair scraped loudly as Calloway leaned forward. "You don't get to tell us how this works." Every time Daniel opened his mouth, he was cut off. His statements were rephrased aloud, twisted into assumptions, scribbled down with selective hearing. When he corrected them, Collins waved it away. "We'll clean it up later," Collins said. Later never came. Hours passed. The questions looped, growing sharper, more accusatory. "Why were you there? Who were you with? Where did you hide it?" Daniel answered truthfully, briefly, refusing to fill silence with desperation. Finally, they stood. "Take him to holding," Collins said. "We'll finalize the report." The report was already finalized. The holding cell was colder than the interrogation room. Bars lined one side, thick and unyielding. A metal bench ran along the wall. The air hummed with the sound of distant footsteps and muffled voices. Daniel sat, elbows on knees, head slightly bowed, not in defeat, but in calculation. He was alone, and that was by design. No one in this building knew, or needed to know yet, that Daniel Carter was a covert federal operative, embedded in Cleveland under an identity built to withstand scrutiny. His real assignment was simple in theory and deadly in execution. Trace a weapons distribution route moving through street-level chaos into organized hands. Exposure tonight would end months of work and put lives at risk. Revealing himself now would clear his name instantly, but it would burn everything else. Daniel stared at the floor, jaw tightening. He chose silence again. Outside the interrogation room, Officer Mark Reynolds stood with his back against the wall. Mark was 26, fresh-faced, with short sandy hair and a frame that hadn't yet hardened into authority. His uniform still looked new. His eyes, however, were already tired. He had joined the force believing in rules, in fairness, in the idea that procedure existed to protect everyone. What he had seen tonight unsettled him. From his position, Mark had watched Calloway's body language, heard the raised voices through the door, noticed how quickly assumptions replaced questions. He remembered the traffic camera mounted on the corner of East 9th, the one that pointed directly at the alley where the real suspects fled. No one mentioned it. When Mark cleared his throat softly, Calloway shot him a look. "Got something to say, Reynolds?" Mark hesitated. "Just the camera outside. It might show—" "We've got enough," Calloway cut in. "Go log evidence." Mark nodded, stepping away, but the discomfort stayed with him. He typed mechanically at his desk, eyes flicking toward the holding cells every few minutes. The system was moving too fast and he was being carried along with it. In a different part of the city, Sarah Whitman sat alone in her apartment, rain streaking down the window beside her. She wrapped both hands around a mug of untouched tea, staring at the wall. Her reflection looked older than she remembered. Tall, thin, shoulders slightly hunched as if bracing for something unseen. Sarah had spent years perfecting politeness, avoiding trouble, convincing herself that staying quiet was a form of survival. But tonight, the image of Daniel against the wall would not leave her. She had seen the young men run. She had seen the police ignore them. And she had said nothing. Her phone buzzed with a local news alert about a swift arrest following a disturbance. Sarah swallowed hard. Back in the holding cell, the door clanged shut for the night. Daniel lay back on the bench, eyes open, listening to the building breathe. Somewhere above him, reports were being signed, narratives locked in place. Somewhere outside, the city moved on. He did not sleep. Silence, once his shield, now pressed down on him like weight. And for the first time that night, Daniel wondered how much longer silence would be enough. The courthouse in Cleveland rose from the wet pavement like a monument to certainty. Morning rain clung to its stone columns, streaking downward as if the building itself were weeping, though nothing inside would soften. The air carried the damp chill of early winter, and the flag above the entrance snapped sharply in the wind. By the time Daniel Carter was brought in through a side door, the day already felt decided. The courtroom was smaller than expected. Wooden benches faced forward in rigid rows, polished smooth by generations of restless hands. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a pale glow that flattened faces and drained warmth from the room. At the front stood the judge's bench, elevated just enough to remind everyone who held authority here. Daniel took his place beside the defense table, his wrists no longer cuffed but still marked with faint red lines. He wore the same black t-shirt and dark jeans from the night before. No suit. No attempt at visual respectability. He stood tall anyway, shoulders squared, expression controlled. His calm was not confidence. It was discipline. The appointed defense attorney, Thomas Keller, shuffled papers nervously beside him. Keller was a thin man in his late 40s, with wire-rimmed glasses that slipped constantly down his nose and a suit that looked one size too large. His hair was thinning at the crown, and worry had etched permanent lines around his mouth. He was not incompetent, but he was overwhelmed. Public defenders rarely had time, resources, or the luxury of patience. This case had already been marked as simple. Across the aisle, the prosecutor rose. Assistant District Attorney Richard Hale was a broad-shouldered man in his early 50s, silver creeping into his dark hair. His suit was tailored, his movements precise, his voice confident without ever needing to rise. Hale believed deeply in optics. To him, persuasion mattered more than proof, and certainty mattered more than doubt. He addressed the jury with practiced ease. The defendant, Hale began, gesturing casually toward Daniel, was found at the scene of a violent disturbance. Witnesses reported aggressive behavior. He matched the description of the suspect. Officers acted swiftly to protect the public. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. No weapon had been recovered. No stolen property. No direct witness pointing at him. Yet the words filled the room, as if facts were unnecessary. Hale continued, layering implication upon implication. We are not here to pretend that coincidence explains everything. We are here to use common sense. Common sense, Daniel knew, often meant assumption. Keller stood to object, clearing his throat. Your Honor, the prosecution has yet to present any physical evidence. Noted, the judge said quickly, waving him down. The judge was Henry Wallace, a man in his early 60s with a heavy frame and thinning gray hair combed neatly back. His robe draped over him like a uniform long worn. Wallace's face carried the stern neutrality of someone who believed efficiency was justice. His eyes moved through the courtroom without lingering on anyone too long. He did not look at Daniel. From the back row, Laura Mitchell watched intently. Laura was a freelance journalist in her mid-30s, with sharp green eyes and a posture that leaned slightly forward as if always listening for something others missed. She wore a simple gray blazer over a dark sweater, her brown hair pulled into a low ponytail. Unlike many reporters, she had not started in newsrooms. She had started with stories no one wanted. Wrongful arrests, ignored complaints, quiet patterns. She had come today because the timeline felt wrong. An arrest made within minutes. Charges filed overnight. A hearing scheduled before scrutiny could catch up. Laura scribbled notes quickly, eyes flicking between the prosecutor, the judge, and Daniel. She noticed the lack of exhibits, the absence of witnesses, the speed. She had seen this rhythm before. When Keller finally managed to speak, his voice wavered slightly, but steadied as he went on. My client was not involved in the disturbance. No weapon was found on him. Multiple individuals fled the scene, yet no attempt was made to pursue them. We request— Your Honor, Hale interrupted smoothly. This is unnecessary. The officers acted appropriately given the circumstances. Wallace nodded. Let's keep things moving. The words landed like a gavel strike. Daniel listened quietly, hands resting at his sides. He felt the familiar frustration rise, not hot, not explosive, but cold and precise. The room had already placed him into a narrative, and he was expected to occupy it without resistance. When it was his turn to speak, he stepped forward. I request that the court review the security camera footage from the intersection of East 9th, Daniel said. His voice was low, steady, carefully controlled. It will show the individuals who fled and confirm that I was not involved. A murmur rippled through the benches. Laura looked up sharply. Hale didn't hesitate. Objection. The footage is irrelevant. Officers on scene made a lawful arrest based on observation. Wallace considered this for less than a second. Objection sustained, he said. The request is denied. The gavel struck once. Daniel did not react outwardly, but something shifted inside him. This was no longer a misunderstanding, it was a decision. Outside the courtroom, Mark Reynolds stood near a vending machine, pretending to read his phone. Mark had been instructed to attend the hearing as part of procedure. His uniform was pressed, his posture correct, but his expression was tight. He had reviewed the arrest report that morning and recognized his own discomfort in its language. Words like aggressive and uncooperative appeared without explanation. He remembered the camera. He remembered the alley, when the doors opened briefly and he caught a glimpse of Daniel standing alone at the defense table. Something in Mark's chest tightened. He told himself to trust the system. He had been trained to. Still, the doubt did not leave. Back inside, the proceedings continued at a relentless pace. Hale summarized. Keller attempted one final appeal to reason, but his words fell flat against the weight of momentum. The judge glanced at the clock. Daniel stood silently, eyes forward. He knew this moment well, the moment when truth was no longer relevant, only outcome. He could feel the weight of it pressing down, urging him to comply, to accept, to disappear quietly into a process that would move on without consequence. But Daniel did not bow his head. When the judge announced a brief recess before sentencing considerations, Daniel exhaled slowly. He had hoped the camera request would buy time. It hadn't. Laura closed her notebook, mind racing. She had enough to dig deeper now, enough to justify pulling records, requesting footage herself, tracing similar cases. This wasn't just about one man. It never was. Daniel was escorted back toward the holding area to wait. As he passed through the corridor, he caught Mark Reynolds' eye. The young officer looked away too quickly, guilt flashing across his face. Daniel noticed. The courtroom behind him resumed its quiet murmur, already moving forward, already convinced. And as the door closed, the truth remained outside, unheard. The courtroom settled into an uneasy stillness as the judge adjusted the papers before him. The rain outside had eased into a fine mist, tapping faintly against the tall windows, but inside the air felt thick, unmoving. This was the moment when sentences were usually spoken, when lives quietly changed direction under the weight of a gavel. Daniel Carter stood straight at the defense table. For most of the morning, his expression had been controlled neutrality, calm, reserved, unreadable. Now, as Judge Henry Wallace prepared to speak, something shifted. Daniel lifted his head slightly. His eyes, dark and steady, carried a focus that had not been there before. It was not anger. It was resolve. "I request permission to make a phone call," Daniel said. His voice cut through the room with unexpected clarity. The words hung in the air. Judge Wallace paused. His hand, already raised to signal the next step, froze. He looked at Daniel for the first time that day, not as a name on a docket, but as a man asking for something outside the routine. The prosecutor, Richard Hale, frowned. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular at this stage." Wallace held up a hand. "I'm aware." The courtroom was silent. Even the low murmurs from the benches died away. Laura Mitchell, seated in the back row, stopped writing. Her pen hovered above the page, forgotten. She felt a subtle tightening in her chest. Requests like this were rarely granted, especially now. Judge Wallace studied Daniel more closely. From the bench, Daniel appeared composed but unyielding, his posture disciplined, his gaze unwavering. Wallace had spent decades on the bench, and he believed he could read men. Most defendants begged. Some blustered. A few broke down. Daniel did none of those things. "How long?" Wallace asked. "Less than a minute," Daniel replied. Hale opened his mouth to object again, then hesitated. Something about the certainty in Daniel's tone unsettled him. After a long moment, Wallace exhaled. "Granted. One call." A ripple of surprise moved through the room. Daniel nodded once, a small acknowledgement, and followed the bailiff toward the side corridor. The door closed behind them, muting the courtroom sounds. The holding area phone was mounted on a gray concrete wall, scratched and dulled from years of use. It smelled faintly of disinfectant and metal. Daniel stepped forward as the bailiff uncuffed one wrist, keeping the other secured loosely. The bailiff, Evan Brooks, was a stocky man in his late 40s with thinning hair and tired eyes. He had worked courthouse security for nearly 2 decades and had learned not to ask questions. Still, as he watched Daniel dial with practiced efficiency, Brooks felt a strange unease. This man did not move like someone cornered. The line connected almost immediately. Daniel did not waste time. "Protocol Raven," he said quietly. "Subject compromised." There was a pause, brief, controlled. "Location?" a voice asked on the other end. "Calm. Female. Professional." "Cleveland," Daniel replied. "Judicial exposure imminent." "Understood," the voice said. "Hold position." The call ended. 17 seconds. Daniel lowered the receiver and stepped back. His expression did not change. No relief, no urgency, only patience. Brooks stared at him for half a second too long before clearing his throat. "Time's up." Daniel said nothing as he was led back toward the courtroom. Inside, tension had crept into every corner. Hale whispered urgently to one of his assistants, irritation sharpening his features. He did not know why, but something about the call gnawed at him. It felt deliberate. Laura Mitchell's instincts were screaming now. She had covered enough quiet scandals to recognize the feeling that precedes revelation. She watched Daniel re-enter, noting how his shoulders remained relaxed, how his breathing was slow and controlled. Whatever that call had been, it was not a plea. In the gallery, Sarah Whitman sat stiffly on the edge of a bench. Sarah had almost not come. She had spent the night replaying the arrest in her mind, the way Daniel had been shoved against the wall, the way she had turned away. Guilt had finally outweighed fear. She wore a simple navy coat, her blonde hair tied back neatly, hands clasped tightly in her lap. Sarah was not accustomed to courtrooms. Confrontation made her uneasy. Years earlier, she had testified in a minor civil case and been torn apart by aggressive questioning. Since then, she avoided anything that might require her to speak publicly. But today, she had come anyway. She watched Daniel closely, searching his face for signs of desperation. She found none. Instead, she saw quiet certainty, and it unsettled her more than panic would have. Judge Wallace cleared his throat. "We will proceed," he said. He glanced down at the file, then back at Daniel. Something about the man before him no longer fit neatly into the assumptions Wallace had been prepared to rely on. Still, procedure was procedure. Before Wallace could continue, a low sound echoed faintly through the hallway outside the courtroom. Measured footsteps, multiple pairs, moving with purpose. The doors at the back of the courtroom did not open. Not yet. Daniel stood silently, eyes forward, hands resting at his sides. To anyone watching closely, there was a subtle change in his posture now. Not tense, not resigned, but ready, like a man who had already set something in motion and was simply waiting for it to arrive. Mark Reynolds, stationed near the wall by the jury box, noticed it. Mark had remained quiet throughout the proceedings, his uniform immaculate, his expression neutral. But as Daniel returned from the phone call, Mark felt a chill run through him. He had grown up around law enforcement. His father had been a patrol officer. He knew the difference between fear and confidence. This was confidence. Mark swallowed, his mind flashing back to the camera footage he had never checked, to the report he had signed without reading closely enough, to the system he had trusted without question. The room felt suddenly smaller. Judge Wallace adjusted his glasses. "Mr. Carter," he began, "before we—" A knock sounded at the courtroom doors. Sharp, deliberate. Every head turned. The bailiff moved instinctively toward the doors, hand raised to signal pause. Wallace frowned, irritation flickering across his face. "What is it?" The knock came again, firmer this time. Daniel did not move. Laura Mitchell leaned forward, heart pounding. Sarah Whitman's breath caught. Judge Wallace hesitated, then nodded once. "Open the door." The bailiff stepped toward the doors, and as the latch turned, the weight of the moment pressed down on the room. Heavy, unavoidable. Daniel remained still, eyes fixed ahead, his silence no longer a shield, but a promise. 20 minutes passed like a held breath. Inside the courtroom, no one spoke above a whisper. Judge Henry Wallace sat rigid behind the bench, fingers interlaced, eyes drifting repeatedly toward the closed doors at the back of the room. The prosecutor, Richard Hale, reviewed his notes again and again without actually reading them, his jaw tightening each time the silence stretched longer. What had felt like control an hour earlier now felt fragile, almost theatrical. Daniel Carter stood where he had been left, unmoving. The minutes did not weigh on him the way they did on everyone else. His posture remained steady, his breathing slow. If there was tension in him, it was buried deep, sealed behind years of training that had taught him how to wait without revealing expectation. He did not look toward the doors. He did not look at the judge. He stared straight ahead, as if the outcome had already been written. From the gallery, Laura Mitchell watched the clock on her phone tick forward. Her instincts, honed through years of uncovering stories that institutions preferred to bury, told her something irreversible was approaching. She noted the way the bailiff shifted his weight, the way Judge Wallace cleared his throat more often than necessary, the way Hale's confidence had thinned into irritation. Sarah Whitman sat 2 rows back, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. She had replayed the arrest over and over in her mind since the night it happened. Every second she had chosen silence. Every moment she had justified fear. Now, as the waiting dragged on, she felt that fear transform into something sharper. Regret. Whatever was coming through those doors, she knew it would make her decision impossible to ignore. Mark Reynolds stood near the side wall, eyes forward, posture professional. Outwardly, he was still the obedient young officer. Inside, his thoughts raced. He had checked the camera location again in his mind, remembered the angle, the clarity, the way it would have shown everything if anyone had bothered to look, if he had bothered to insist. The knock came again. This time, it was not tentative. It was final. The bailiff stepped forward at Judge Wallace's nod and pulled the doors open. 3 men entered the courtroom. They wore dark, tailored suits. No insignia at first glance, no attempt to dominate the space through volume or gesture. Yet the effect was immediate. Their presence carried a weight that pressed the air downward, silencing even the quiet murmurs that had survived until now. The man in front was in his early 40s, tall and broad-shouldered with close-cropped black hair and a face carved into sharp, disciplined lines. His expression was calm, almost unreadable, eyes scanning the room with measured precision. He moved like someone accustomed to rooms falling silent when he entered. Behind him walked a slightly older man with silver threaded through his dark hair, leaner in build, his gaze observant rather than confrontational. The third was younger, athletic, carrying a slim black case, his demeanor alert but restrained. As they reached the center aisle, the lead man stopped and reached inside his jacket, withdrawing a badge that caught the overhead light. "Federal Bureau of Investigation," he said evenly. "Special Agent Michael Grant." The words landed like a dropped object in a glass room. Judge Wallace straightened abruptly. "Agent Grant, to what do we owe?" "We're here regarding the defendant," Grant replied, his tone respectful but immovable. "Daniel Carter." Every eye turned. Daniel did not react. Agent Grant approached the bench and placed a sealed folder gently in front of the judge. His movements were deliberate, careful, as though each step followed a protocol already rehearsed. "This court has been proceeding under incomplete information," Grant continued. "We are here to correct that." Richard Hale rose halfway from his seat. "Your Honor, I object. This is highly irregular." Grant turned his head slightly, fixing Hale with a brief, assessing look. "So is detaining a federal operative under false charges." The room froze. Laura's pen slipped from her fingers, clattering softly against the floor. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Mark Reynolds felt the ground shift beneath him. Judge Wallace's face drained of color. "Federal operative?" Grant nodded once and opened the folder. Inside were credentials, authorizations, and sealed documents marked with classifications Wallace recognized but rarely encountered directly. Grant slid one forward. "Mr. Carter is an embedded asset operating under joint federal authority. His assignment requires anonymity and non-disclosure until mission compromise. That compromise occurred the moment he was detained." Wallace stared at the papers, then up at Daniel. Daniel met his gaze calmly. Grant gestured to the younger agent, who stepped forward and set the black case on the prosecution table. He opened it, revealing a laptop already powered on. "We have also obtained traffic camera footage from East 9th Street, Grant said. "The footage your court declined to review." Hale's mouth opened, then closed again. The screen flickered to life. The courtroom leaned forward as one. The footage was clear. Too clear to argue with. 4 young men appeared on screen, their movements frantic, aggressive. One brandished a metallic object. The group scattered as sirens approached, splitting into separate alleys. The timestamp rolled forward. Then Daniel appeared, exiting the convenience store seconds later, backpack over his shoulder, moving in the opposite direction. He did not interact with the group. He did not run. He did not raise his voice. The arrest followed. Silence filled the room, thick and undeniable. "There is no ambiguity here," Grant said. "Mr. Carter was not involved in the disturbance. He was misidentified, detained, and processed based on assumption." Judge Wallace swallowed hard. Grant turned slightly, addressing the room more broadly now. "Furthermore, Mr. Carter's detention disrupted an ongoing federal investigation. That disruption will be addressed separately." The implication settled heavily over the officers present. Mark Reynolds felt his chest tighten, not with fear, but with a painful clarity. He had known something was wrong. Knowing, it turned out, was not the same as acting. Sarah Whitman stared at the screen. tears welling despite her effort to hold them back. She had seen this truth with her own eyes days ago, and had chosen silence. Now the truth stood on its own, and she felt smaller for having doubted it. Laura Mitchell's hands shook slightly as she reached for her notebook again. This was bigger than a wrongful arrest. This was exposure. Judge Wallace cleared his throat, voice unsteady. The court acknowledges this information. Mr. Carter. Daniel finally moved. He stepped forward one pace, posture still composed, eyes steady. I am requesting immediate dismissal of all charges, he said calmly, and my release. Grant nodded. That request is supported. Wallace did not hesitate this time. Granted. The gavel struck once. Daniel Carter was free, but the sound echoed differently now, not as an ending, but as a reckoning. Daniel exhaled quietly. No triumph showed on his face, no satisfaction, only a deep, controlled calm. His silence had been mistaken for weakness. It had been discipline all along. And as the courtroom struggled to absorb the truth standing plainly before it, Daniel knew this chapter was complete. The consequences were only beginning. The courthouse doors opened wide, and for the first time that day, light moved freely inside. Daniel Carter stepped forward, no chains on his wrists, no officer guiding his shoulder. The air outside was clean after the rain, the clouds thinning into pale breaks of blue. Sunlight spilled across the stone steps, catching dust and water alike, turning the moment almost unreal in its calm. The ruling had been clear. All charges dismissed, immediate release. But the courtroom had not emptied with relief. It had emptied with consequence. Inside, the machinery of accountability had already begun to turn. Judge Henry Wallace remained seated long after the gavel struck, his shoulders heavier than before. The documents in front of him no longer looked routine, they looked damning. Years on the bench had taught him to value speed, efficiency, closure. That instinct had failed him. The Judicial Council's notice arrived before the afternoon recess. An official review, mandatory cooperation, public findings. Wallace read it twice, then folded it carefully, his expression distant. For the first time in a long career, he understood that neutrality could be a form of harm. Across the hall, Assistant District Attorney Richard Hale stood alone near a window, phone pressed to his ear. His voice was low, clipped, stripped of the confidence that had once carried him through courtrooms. The Internal Affairs Division had requested his case files, this case and others like it. A pattern, they said. Selective evidence. Repeated dismissal of footage. Hale stared out at the courthouse steps, at the reporters gathering below, and felt the walls close in. He had believed he was protecting order. Now he was facing the cost of that belief. At the police precinct, suspension notices were delivered quietly but firmly. Officer Brian Calloway's badge was taken without ceremony. He did not argue. His shoulders sagged as if he had expected this outcome long before it arrived. Power, it turned out, left marks that could not be scrubbed clean with justification. The internal investigation widened quickly. Emails were pulled, reports re-examined, footage reviewed, not just from East 9th, but from months past. Names surfaced, patterns emerged. The phrase isolated incident dissolved under evidence. Justice, once delayed, was moving fast now. Officer Mark Reynolds sat in a small conference room with a recorder placed neatly between himself and two investigators from Internal Affairs. The room was plain, windowless, designed to remove distraction. Mark's uniform felt heavier than usual against his shoulders. He spoke carefully, truthfully. He described the arrest, the report, the camera he had remembered but failed to insist upon. His voice did not shake, but his hands rested flat on the table to keep them still. He did not attempt to excuse himself. He did not minimize his silence. "I knew something was wrong," Mark said, "and I didn't push hard enough." The lead investigator, a woman in her 50s with close-cropped gray hair and an expression sharpened by years of listening, nodded once. She did not interrupt. Mark finished, exhaled slowly. 2 days later, his reassignment became official. He would join the internal review unit, not as punishment, but as a witness and a resource. Some colleagues avoided his eyes, others nodded quietly in understanding. Mark accepted both reactions without complaint. His idea of justice had changed. It no longer meant obedience. It meant responsibility. Laura Mitchell published her first article within 24 hours. The headline was precise, unflinching. She wrote with clarity, not outrage. She laid out the timeline, the footage, the procedural failures. She named names where evidence allowed and outlined systems where blame was collective. By the end of the week, her investigation expanded into a series, each piece tracing a similar arc, each one grounded in records rather than rhetoric. The response was immediate. National outlets picked up the story. Civil rights organizations requested interviews. City officials issued statements promising reform. Laura did not celebrate. She had learned that attention was not the same as change. Still, she worked longer hours than ever, fueled not by anger, but by the steady conviction that silence was the most dangerous bias of all. At her small apartment desk, she taped a single sentence above her screen. Truth doesn't shout, it persists. Sarah Whitman stood among the crowd at the courthouse steps, sunlight warming her face. She had almost left before the press arrived, almost slipped away as she usually did. But something held her there. She watched Daniel speak calmly to reporters, his posture relaxed but dignified. No bitterness edged his words, no accusation, just clarity. Sarah was tall, slender, with a habit of shrinking herself in public spaces, of yielding ground to avoid conflict. Years ago, she had learned that speaking up could invite cruelty. That lesson had followed her faithfully until now. She felt it loosening its grip. When a journalist asked if there were witnesses who had seen the arrest unfold, Sarah hesitated for a heartbeat, then stepped forward. Her voice trembled at first, then steadied as she spoke. She described what she had seen, what she had known, what she had failed to say that night. It was not redemption, but it was a beginning. Daniel waited until the noise died down before leaving the steps. He stood alone for a moment, looking up at the courthouse he had entered as a suspect and left as a mirror. The sun rested low now, casting long shadows across the plaza. He inhaled deeply, grounding himself in the present. Agent Michael Grant approached quietly, hands in his coat pockets. Without the badge and formality, he looked almost ordinary. A tall man with lines at the corners of his eyes, shaped by years of responsibility. "Good work holding the line," Grant said. Daniel nodded. It needed to hold. Grant studied him for a moment. "The task force will resume. Adjustments made. You're cleared to continue if you choose." Daniel considered this, gaze drifting back to the city. Cleveland moved, as it always had. Cars passing, people walking, unaware of the quiet shifts beneath their feet. "I'll continue," Daniel said, "but not the same way." Grant smiled faintly. "I figured." They shook hands once, firmly. No ceremony. As Daniel descended the courthouse steps, a reporter called out one final question. "Mr. Carter, do you have anything you want to say?" Daniel turned. The cameras focused. The crowd stilled. He spoke without raising his voice. "Justice doesn't see skin color," he said. "People do. And when people let that decide who deserves fairness, they must be held accountable." He paused, then added, "That's how justice stays justice." Daniel turned away. No applause followed him. None was needed. The sun dipped lower, bathing the steps in gold. For once, justice had not just corrected itself. It had remembered who it was for. Daniel Carter didn't walk away as a victor. He walked away as proof proof that silence is not guilt, that restraint is not weakness, and that dignity can survive even when truth is pushed into a corner and told to wait. This story was never just about a man in handcuffs. It was about how quickly fear chooses a face and how slowly justice learns to listen. About the cost of staying quiet and the courage it takes to finally speak. And if there is one thing this story asks of us, it is this: when you see someone judged before being heard, don't look away, because justice doesn't break all at once. It erodes every time good people decide it isn't their moment to speak. And when someone is willing to stand, even alone, and hold on to the truth until it is finally seen, that is how justice remembers itself.